somewhere beneath the world you know, beyond the last reach of sunlight, beyond the final threshold of breath and heartbeat, a river moves. It does not rush. It does not roar. It simply flows, dark and deliberate and eternal, carrying with it every secret that the living were never meant to keep. This is the Styx, and long before the first temple was raised in its name, long before a single word of it was written down in ink or carved into stone, human beings already sensed it. They felt it the way one feels weather before it arrives. In the air, in the bones, in the quiet dread that visits us in the hours before dawn, the certainty that somewhere, just past the edge of everything we can touch and measure and hold, there is a river waiting, patient, absolute, and profoundly, almost beautifully, still. The ancient Greeks gave it a name. They gave it banks, and a ferryman, and rules, because that is what human beings do when they encounter something that frightens them deeply enough. They make it navigable. They draw a map. But make no mistake, the Styx was never simply a story. It was a reckoning, a philosophy, a mirror held up to the mortal world, asking the one question that no amount of cleverness or courage has ever fully answered. What are you willing to face, to become something more than what you are? The River Styx wound 9 times around the underworld, 9 great, slow coils, like something sleeping, like something thinking. It formed the outermost boundary of Hades, that vast and shadowed kingdom where the dead went not as punishment, but simply as destination. Because in the Greek understanding of things, death was not an ending so much as a transition, a relocation. And the Styx was the door, but it was far more than a border. The Styx was a force, the gods themselves, the Olympians, who flung lightning and moved mountains and reshaped the very face of the earth on a whim. They swore their most unbreakable oaths by its waters. To invoke the Styx was to invoke something older than Zeus, older than Olympus itself. If a god broke an oath sworn upon the Styx, the punishment was severe. They were made to lie senseless and breathless for a full year, stripped of ambition and voice and motion, and then exiled from the company of the divine for 9 years more. Even immortality, it seems, has its consequences. Even power has its contracts. And the Styx was the witness to all of them, the goddess of the river herself. Styx, daughter of the Titans, Oceanus and Tethys, was said to be the first of all the immortals to come to Zeus's aid during the great war against the Titans. For that loyalty, she was given an honor unlike any other. Her name became sacred law. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider following our show as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Her waters became the seal upon which all divine promises were made binding. She became, in the truest sense, the gravity of heaven, the unseen force that kept even gods honest. And then there were those who bathed in it. The stories are few, and they are extraordinary. The most enduring belongs to a mother and her infant son, to the sea nymph Thetis, who cradled the child Achilles in her arms and walked into those dark, cold waters, holding him by the heel, submerging him completely in the river's immortal flow. What she was seeking was simple and ancient and achingly human. She did not want her son to die. She had been told of his fate, glory, yes, and fame that would outlast empires, but also an early death on the shores of Troy. And so she did what mothers have always done when confronted with the unbearable. She tried to change it. The Styx made Achilles nearly invulnerable. Sword and spear and arrow found no purchase on his skin. He moved through battle like something the world could not fully claim. And yet, the heel, the one small place where her fingers had gripped him, the one small place the water never reached, that was all it took. In the end, it is always the smallest thing. There were others who sought the river's gifts. Rumors of warriors anointed with its waters, of heroes whose skin turned like stone beneath the enemy's blade. The Styx, it was said, could grant what the gods themselves possessed, not merely long life, but permanence, the sense that you might endure. What a thing to want! What a deeply, quietly human thing to want. And so we begin. Here, at the edge of the dark water, where the air smells of stone and old silence, and the current moves with the unhurried confidence of something that has never once needed to hurry. Because the Styx has been here since before the first human drew breath, and it will be here long after the last one has crossed its banks. We have time. Let us look more closely. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to deep places, not the silence of an empty room or of a forest after snowfall. Those silences are temporary, small, polite pauses between sounds that will return. The silence of deep places is different. It has weight. It has intent. It is the silence of somewhere that was never designed for the living to be, and which does not particularly accommodate their presence. That is the silence of the underworld. And to understand the Styx, truly understand it, not merely as a river, but as a world unto itself, we must first understand the place it calls home. We must learn its landscape, because the Greeks did not imagine the realm of the dead as a vague and shapeless dark. They mapped it, they named it, they populated it with rivers and plains and palaces and judges, with gates and guardians and roads that souls were expected to follow. The underworld in the Greek imagination was not chaos, it was organized. And like all organized places, it had a logic. And that logic, followed carefully, tells us everything. The kingdom of Hades sat beneath the earth itself, not metaphorically, but literally, in the ancient understanding. You descended to reach it. The dead traveled down, and this is a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not accidental. In nearly every ancient culture that has ever placed an afterlife somewhere, the instinct to put it below, beneath the feet, beneath the ground, beneath the roots of things, speaks to something the conscious mind has never fully articulated, but the body always seems to know. The earth receives, the earth keeps. What goes into the ground does not, as a rule, come back. Hades was vast. The Greeks were not interested in a cramped or modest afterlife. Their underworld had regions, the way a continent has regions, distinct territories with distinct characters, each serving a different purpose in the great sorting of souls that death required. And threading through all of it, binding it together the way rivers bind landscapes, were the 5 rivers of the underworld. 5 rivers, each with its own name, its own nature, its own particular gift or burden to bestow upon those who encountered it. To know these rivers is to understand the architecture of the ancient Greek afterlife in a way that no amount of reading about Hades himself can quite provide. The rivers are the structure. They are the connective tissue. They are, in a very real sense, the place. The first and most terrible was the Styx. We have already felt its presence. That dark, slow, 9 times coiling boundary river, the one by which gods swore and heroes bathed, and ferrymen earned their keep. It was the outermost edge, the great encircling wall of water, and it set the terms for everything within. But its companions deserve equal attention, because together the 5 rivers form something remarkable, a complete emotional and psychological map of what the ancients believed death actually felt like from the inside. The second river was the Acheron, the river of woe. This was, in many tellings, the river that the newly dead encountered first. It was the Acheron that Charon navigated with his pole and his silence, ferrying souls from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The Acheron was cold and grey and slow, and the crossing of it was the moment of true departure. The point at which the soul understood, in whatever way souls understand things, that it was not going back. There is something almost merciful in this. The Greeks gave grief its own river. They acknowledged that the transition from life to death was not instantaneous or clean, that it carried its own particular sorrow, and they honored that sorrow by giving it a name and a home. The third was the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And this one, perhaps more than any other, has captured the human imagination across centuries because it speaks to something we both fear and quietly crave. To drink from the Lethe was to forget everything. Your name, your loves, your failures, the face of your mother, the weight of every regret you ever carried. Souls bound for reincarnation, for a new life in a new body, were brought to the Lethe to drink so that they might begin again without the accumulated burden of everything they had been before. It was not punishment. It was, the Greeks seemed to suggest, a kind of grace, a reset. The river offered what no living human can ever truly access, a genuine, total, irrevocable fresh start. And yet, not everyone was required to drink. The mystery cults of ancient Greece, particularly the Orphic tradition, taught initiates to do something radical upon arriving in the underworld, to refuse the Lethe, to turn away from forgetfulness and seek instead a second river found nearby whose waters offered the opposite gift. This was the Mnemosyne, the river of memory, the river of remembering. To drink from the Mnemosyne was to retain everything, to carry your full self, intact and aware, into whatever came next. It was considered a mark of spiritual advancement, of having lived a life conscious enough to be worth remembering. The tension between these two rivers, forget or remember, release or hold, is one of the oldest questions philosophy ever asked, dressed here in the language of myth and moving water. The fourth river was the Phlegethon, the river of fire. Where the others were cold and dark and still, the Phlegethon burned. It was a river, not of water but of flame, roiling, relentless, and according to some accounts flowing directly to the deepest region of the underworld, the place called Tartarus, where the worst of the wicked were sent not merely to rest, but to suffer. Plato wrote of it. Dante, centuries later, drew from it. The Phlegethon reminds us that the Greek underworld was not designed to be entirely comfortable. It had its shadows within shadows, its places of consequence. Fire and water together, the Styx and the Phlegethon, formed a kind of elemental opposition at the heart of the realm. Cold judgment on one side, burning consequence on the other. The fifth and final river was the Cocytus, the river of lamentation. It was said to be formed from the tears of the dead, from the weeping of souls who could not be ferried across the Styx, those who had not received proper burial rites, or who could not pay Charon's fee, and were therefore condemned to wander the near shore for 100 years before crossing. The Cocytus was grief made literal, made geographical. It flowed from sorrow, it carried sorrow, and it delivered sorrow to the deeper reaches of the underworld. Of all 5 rivers, it is perhaps the one that resonates most clearly even now, because every culture in human history has understood, instinctively, in the marrow, that there is something profoundly wrong about a death that goes unacknowledged, about a soul that is not properly mourned, not properly released, not properly sent on its way. The Greeks did not just feel that. They built it into the landscape of their afterlife. Neglect the dead, and the consequences flow. Sometimes literally. Now, with all 5 rivers understood, with the terrain around us mapped and named, we can return to the Styx itself and see it more clearly for knowing what surrounds it. It is the boundary, yes. It is the Oath River and the Immortality River and the great encircling dark. But it is also the first of the 5, the one that sets the tone for everything else a soul will encounter on its journey inward. Cross the Styx, and you have committed. You have accepted the terms. Whatever forgetfulness or fire or lamentation lies ahead, you have agreed, by the simple act of crossing, to face it. There was only one way across, one narrow vessel, one silent figure who worked the pole and held out his hand for payment, Charon. Even his name sounds like a door closing. He was old in all the ways that things older than time are old, not frail, but settled, fixed into his purpose the way stone is fixed into a cliff face, without complaint and without ambition. He did not hate his work. He did not love it. He simply performed it, crossing and recrossing back and forth across the dark water, for every soul that had ever died and every soul that ever would. His fee was modest, a coin, an obol, placed beneath the tongue or over the eyes of the dead by those who loved them and understood the stakes. Without it, the soul waited at the water's edge in the company of the Cocytus for 100 long and formless years. It is worth pausing here to consider what that burial coin represents. It is perhaps the oldest known act of love in human history. The simple decision to provide for someone on a journey you cannot take with them. To press a coin into the hand of the dead, or lay it gently over their eyes, and say without words, "I want you to be able to cross. I want the ferryman to take you. I want you to get where you are going." The Styx demanded that of the living. A small toll, but a meaningful one. And on the far bank, the rest of the underworld waited, patient and permanent and ready to receive. There is a certain kind of human being, and the Greeks knew this type well, because they both admired and feared them, who, upon being told that something cannot be done, or should not be done, or has never been survived, tilts their head very slightly to one side and says nothing at all, and then does it anyway. The Greeks called them heroes. We still use that word, though we have softened it considerably over the centuries. In the original understanding, a hero was not simply someone brave or good or admirable. A hero was someone who existed at the precise and dangerous intersection of the mortal and the divine. Too extraordinary to be fully human, too human to be fully safe. They were, in the most literal sense, boundary figures. And nothing attracted boundary figures quite like the Styx, because the Styx was the ultimate boundary, the line between the living and the dead, between the world of consequence and the world of completion. And if a hero's entire purpose was to go where others could not, to endure what others would not, to return from places that were designed to be one way, then the River Styx was not merely a setting in their stories. It was their greatest test, their final examination, the place where the myth proved whether it meant what it claimed. Let us begin with the one whose story we already know in part, and follow it to its end. Achilles. The name alone carries a kind of music. It always has. Homer understood this, and arranged his great poem around it, the way a composer arranges an orchestra around a single instrument. Everything else serves to illuminate that central sound. Achilles was the son of Thetis, the sea nymph, and Peleus, a mortal king. He was born into the impossible tension that defined him, divine heritage on one side, human mortality on the other. His mother knew from the moment of his birth exactly how his story would end. The gods had told her. Troy would make him immortal in name and legend, and it would kill him in body, early and violently and far from home. What Thetis did next is one of the most quietly devastating acts in all of mythology. She carried him to the Styx. Picture it for a moment, not as an illustration in a book, but as a real thing happening in real darkness. A mother, who is herself a creature of water, stepping into a river that is older than the gods she serves, holding her infant son against her chest with one hand and gripping his ankle with the other, the water black and cold and impossibly still. The far bank invisible, no light, no warmth, no sound, but the movement of something vast and patient beneath the surface. She submerged him completely, or as completely as her grip allowed, because she could not bear the alternative. She was not reckless. She was not foolish. She was desperate, in the specific and eternal way that love makes desperate those who practice it fully. The Styx did what the Styx does. It granted its dark gift, and Achilles grew up invulnerable, blade and arrow finding nothing to hold in his skin, battle offering him no permanent purchase. He moved through war like weather, like a force of nature rather than a man. And at Troy, he was everything the prophecy promised, brilliant and terrible and blazing, until the arrow, until the heel, the single place where his mother's fingers had been, the one small coordinate on the map of his body that the river had never reached. And Paris, guided, some say, by the hand of Apollo himself, found it. The arrow found it, as though the universe, patient and precise, had simply been waiting for the right angle. The tragedy of Achilles is not that he died. Everyone dies. The tragedy is that his protection was so nearly complete, that the margin between mortality and invulnerability was, in his case, no wider than a mother's grip. It makes you wonder, and the Greeks very much intended for you to wonder, whether the Styx was making a point, whether there is something in the nature of the river, something in the nature of immortality itself that requires a remainder. A small, deliberate gap, as though the universe will not allow perfection. As though even the darkest and most powerful water in existence understands that a being without any vulnerability at all is not a hero. It is something else entirely. Now consider a different kind of crossing altogether. Consider Orpheus, where Achilles approached the underworld through water and the prayers of his mother. Orpheus approached it on his own feet, in his own grief, with nothing in his hands but a lyre. Orpheus was the greatest musician who ever lived, not merely skilled, but mythically gifted, in the way that certain figures in myth are given abilities that function less like talents and more like laws of nature. When Orpheus played, rivers slowed their current to listen, stones turned themselves toward the sound, wild animals lay down beside each other in the grass, predator and prey equally transfixed, and for the duration of the music, forgot entirely what they were supposed to be doing to one another. When his wife Eurydice died, suddenly, on the very day of their wedding, from a serpent's bite, Orpheus did not accept it. He could not, and so he descended. He crossed the Styx. Charon, who had never in all his endless tenure been moved by anything, paused his pole and listened as Orpheus played. The music did what arguments could not. The music did what heroism, in the conventional sense, strength, endurance, combat, could not. It persuaded. It softened. It made the ferryman, for the first and only time in the history of the crossing, simply step aside and wave someone through without payment. Within Hades itself, Orpheus played on. The Furies, those ancient and merciless agents of divine justice, whose entire function was the enforcement of consequence, wept. They had never wept before. They did not know they could. Sisyphus, eternally condemned to push his boulder up the hill and watch it roll back down, sat down and rested for the first time in his punishment. The stone stopped. The music had reached even that. Persephone, queen of the underworld, pressed her hands together before her face. Hades himself, who had, in the long history of the cosmos, given back nothing, refused everything, remained unmoved by every appeal that grief and desperation had ever produced, relented. He offered Orpheus his wife on one condition: walk back to the surface, walk ahead of her, do not look back, trust that she is following. It is the simplest instruction. It is the hardest instruction. Anyone who has ever waited for news they could not yet have, or trusted in something they could not yet see, understands exactly why Orpheus failed it. He was almost there, the surface almost in sight, the first suggestions of light beginning to reach down from above, when the doubt arrived. Not doubt in Hades exactly, doubt in himself. doubt in his own worthiness to receive this gift, the terrible human suspicion that things this important do not actually work out. He turned, and Eurydice, who had been there right behind him, faithful and present and almost free, was taken back. Gently, we are told, without cruelty. Simply taken back, as the terms required. The Styx kept what it had. The Styx always kept what it had. Then there was Heracles in the Roman telling, who approached the underworld with rather less music and considerably more intention to cause structural damage if necessary. Heracles descended as part of his famous 12 labors, charged with capturing Cerberus, the great three-headed guardian dog who stood watch at the gates of Hades and ensured that souls moved in only one direction. He crossed the Styx, Charon ferrying him across, some accounts suggest, out of simple intimidation, because Heracles looked at the ferryman in a way that made arguments seem inadvisable, and negotiated directly with Hades for temporary custody of the creature. What is remarkable about Heracles in the underworld is not the feat itself. He accomplished feats of equal or greater physical difficulty with some regularity, but the permission, he asked. He went to Hades, king of the dead, and made his case, and Hades agreed, on the condition that Heracles use no weapons, only his bare hands and his famous strength, which Heracles accepted because Heracles was, among other things, a man who was genuinely fine with that arrangement. He subdued Cerberus. He returned to the surface with the animal. He completed the labor, and then he brought Cerberus back, because Heracles, for all his wildness, understood something about the Styx and the world it bounded. You could visit, you could achieve extraordinary things in the visiting, but you returned what you borrowed. You restored what you had moved. The dead stayed dead. The guardian returned to his post. The river kept flowing. These stories, Achilles, Orpheus, Heracles, are not simply tales of bravery. They are a taxonomy of the ways human beings have imagined confronting the absolute. With love, with art, with force, each approach achieving something remarkable, each approach ultimately discovering the same truth. The Styx yields, but only so far, and it always keeps the final word. There is something deeply interesting about the moment when power acknowledges something more powerful than itself. We see it rarely in the world of the living. Power in human hands tends to resist acknowledgement of its own limits, tends to insist, loudly and often, that it answers to nothing and no one. But the Greeks were too honest and too observant to build their gods that way entirely. They gave their Olympians extraordinary power, yes. Thunder and sea and harvest and war, all of it distributed among immortal hands that never trembled, never tired, never released what they held. And yet they also gave their gods something that power almost never voluntarily accepts: a higher authority. And that authority was not a person, or a principle, or even a god. It was a river. To understand why the Styx held such extraordinary dominion over the Olympians, why Zeus himself, who split the sky with lightning and whose word reshaped the cosmos on a whim, bowed to the dark water's judgment, we have to return to the beginning. Not the beginning of the myths as stories, but the beginning as the Greeks understood it cosmologically. The moment before the gods we recognize had yet secured their place in the order of things. Before Olympus there was war. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians, lasted 10 years by the ancient reckoning. 10 years of cosmic violence that shook the foundations of the earth and threatened to unmake the order of things entirely. Zeus and his siblings, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Hades, had risen against the Titans who preceded them, and the outcome, for much of that terrible decade, was genuinely uncertain. Power of that magnitude, on both sides, produces a conflict, that has no obvious resolution. The universe held its breath. It was in this moment that Styx, the goddess, the river, the ancient daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, made her choice. She came to Zeus. She came voluntarily, without being summoned, without being coerced, bringing with her not merely her allegiance, but her children, Nike, the spirit of victory, and Kratos and Bia, the embodiments of strength and force themselves. She placed all of it at the feet of the young god who was trying to remake the order of heaven. She said, in the language of myth, "I believe in what you are building. I am with you." It was not a small gesture. In a conflict where the outcome was unknown and the cost of choosing the losing side was annihilation, Styx committed absolutely. And when the Titans fell, when Olympus was secured and the new order of the cosmos locked into place, Zeus remembered. He rewarded her with an honor that no other being in the Greek cosmos possessed in quite the same form. Her name became the binding force of divine promise. To swear by the Styx was to invoke something that predated the Olympians, something that had existed before Zeus had his throne or his lightning bolt, something that belonged to an older and more fundamental layer of the cosmos. The Greeks understood, intuitively, that the most reliable guarantor of a promise is not someone who is merely powerful. It is something that is prior, something that was there before the current arrangement of things, and will be thereafter. The Styx qualified. It had been flowing since before the gods were gods. It would flow after their stories had ceased to be told. Zeus did not merely endorse the Styx as a convenient oath mechanism. He made it structurally absolute. A god who swore falsely by the Styx was not simply punished. They were suspended. They were removed from the functioning of the cosmos for a period. For a full year, the oath-breaking god would lie in a state that the ancient sources describe with striking consistency. Breathless, voiceless, unable to participate in the feast of the gods or attend their councils. A kind of divine coma. A year of removal from everything that made immortality meaningful. Not death, because gods could not die, but something adjacent to it. Something that demonstrated with absolute clarity that immortality without integrity is not quite what it advertises itself to be. After that first year came 9 more, 9 years of exile from the company of the Olympians. 9 years of isolation, of being neither fully dead nor fully alive in the divine sense, wandering outside the warmth of Olympus and its fellowship. 10 years total, the same length, notably, as the Titanomachy itself, the same length as the Trojan War. The Greeks had a sense of poetic proportion that was rarely accidental. The gods knew this. They felt it. And so when a divine oath invoked the Styx, it carried a weight that no mortal witness or written contract could approximate. It carried consequence, real, felt, inescapable consequence. The most famous instance of a divine Styx oath, gone treacherously complicated, belongs to Helios and Phaethon, or more precisely, to the reckless intersection of a father's pride and a son's ambition. Helios, the god of the sun, in a moment of warmth and generosity toward his mortal son Phaethon, made the catastrophic error of swearing by the Styx before hearing the request. He promised his son anything he desired, by the Styx, irrevocably, and Phaethon desired, of all things, to drive the solar chariot, to take the reins of the sun itself and pull it across the sky for a single day. Helios understood immediately what he had done. He pleaded, he reasoned, he explained with great clarity and considerable desperation that the horses of the sun were not manageable by mortal hands, that the route was treacherous beyond description, that the world below would burn and the heavens would tilt. All of this was entirely true, and none of it mattered. The oath had been sworn. The Styx had heard it. There was no mechanism in the divine order for retrieving a promise made to that river. Phaethon took the reins. The horses, sensing immediately that the grip on them was wrong, that the weight behind them was insufficient, bolted from the prescribed path. The chariot swung too close to the earth. Rivers boiled, forests ignited, deserts were born in the scorching passage of the uncontrolled sun. Zeus, watching the world begin to burn beneath him, made the only decision available. He struck Phaethon from the chariot with a thunderbolt and let the boy fall, trailing fire, into the river Eridanus below. The earth was saved. Phaethon was dead. Helios wept. The ancient sources tell us his grief was extraordinary and prolonged, that the sun itself dimmed for a time, that his divine sorrow was as outsized as his divine error, and all of it began with a Styx oath sworn carelessly in a moment of fatherly affection before the terms were known. The lesson the Greeks embedded in this story is one they return to repeatedly, in different shapes and different registers. Power without precision is catastrophe. Even the gift of invulnerability, even the promise of divine favor, can become the instrument of destruction when deployed without full attention to its terms. The Styx did not punish Helios directly. It did not need to. It simply held the oath in place, immovable and indifferent, and allowed the consequences to flow from the promise he had made. The river does not enforce. It merely remembers, and its memory is perfect and permanent, and without any capacity for mercy or amendment. There is one more divine story that belongs here, quieter than Phaethon's catastrophe, but in some ways more unsettling. Demeter, goddess of harvest and grain, the great sustainer of mortal life, lost her daughter Persephone to Hades, taken down into the underworld while the girl gathered flowers in a meadow, the earth opening beneath her feet, and the king of the dead claiming her as his queen. Demeter's grief was so absolute that she withdrew her gifts from the world. The crops failed. The earth hardened. Living things began to starve. The gods, watching the mortal world wither, understood that a resolution was needed urgently. Zeus mediated. Terms were negotiated. Persephone would spend part of each year above ground, with her mother, and part below with her husband. The seasons, the Greeks explained, were born from this arrangement. The earth blooming when Demeter's daughter returned, retreating into cold when she descended again. But embedded in this story, in certain tellings, is the Styx once more. Because Hades swore his own agreements by it. Because the terms of Persephone's movement between worlds, the specific conditions under which she could leave and must return, were not simply understood between parties. They were sworn, witnessed by the dark water, made permanent by the river that makes things permanent. The Styx, in these divine stories, functions as something that has no clean modern equivalent. It is older than law and more reliable. It is more personal than a contract and more absolute. It is the place where even the most powerful beings in the Greek cosmos came, hat in hand, to make their promises mean something, because they understood. And this is perhaps the most quietly profound thing the Greeks ever encoded in their mythology, that power alone is never enough to guarantee truth, that even gods need somewhere to stand when they want to be believed. They stood at the Styx, they spoke its name, and the dark water held what they said in its current forever. There is a moment in the study of ancient mythology when something unexpected happens. You are moving through the stories, comfortable in their symbolism, at ease with their distance, content to appreciate them as magnificent expressions of the human imagination. And then, without warning, the ground shifts. A detail emerges that does not belong to the world of pure invention. A geographical coordinate. A physical description too precise to be decorative. A chemical property that no storyteller simply makes up. And suddenly the myth is not floating freely in the imagination anymore. It is standing on solid earth in a specific place, under a specific sky, and it is asking you to reconsider the comfortable distance you thought you had from it. The Styx does this. It does it quietly, and it does it completely. And once it has done it, the river is never quite the same thing again. In the northeastern region of the Peloponnese, in the ancient territory known as Arcadia, that mountainous, densely forested heartland of southern Greece that the Greeks themselves considered wild and primordial, a place older in spirit than the city-states and their marble ambitions, there is a waterfall. It descends from a high cliff face in the Aronian Mountains, in a region near the ancient settlement of Non-Acris, and it falls a considerable distance before gathering itself into a stream below. The locals have known it for as long as anyone can establish. Its ancient name, preserved in the sources, is the Mavroneri, the Black Water. The Greeks called it the Styx, not metaphorically, not as a poetic gesture toward the mythological river. They called it the Styx because they believed, with the full seriousness that the ancient world brought to such matters, that this was the real thing, or at minimum, the earthly expression of it, the point where the mythological river broke the surface of the mortal world and made itself briefly, dangerously visible. Pausanias, the Greek traveler and geographer of the 2nd century, who left behind one of the most valuable eyewitness accounts of the ancient world we possess, visited the site and described it with careful attention. He noted the cliff from which the water descended, the cold and the darkness of the place, the particular atmosphere that hung around it, a quality of quiet and unease that he found difficult to fully account for in purely rational terms. He recorded the local belief that the water was harmful, perhaps lethally so, to living things that drank from it or came into prolonged contact with it. Animals would not drink willingly from it, he reported, and those that did, or were made to, suffered for it. This was not simply folklore decorating a picturesque waterfall. Modern science, arriving at the site many centuries after Pausanias with rather different tools, found something genuinely remarkable. The water of the Mavroneri contains high concentrations of caliciamican, or more precisely, the rock over which it flows and from which it derives its mineral content includes geological formations rich in compounds that produce effects on living tissue consistent with what the ancients described. The water is, by measurable and reproducible analysis, toxic, not dramatically, not in the manner of a fast-acting poison, but persistently and genuinely dangerous in a way that would have been entirely evident to anyone who observed its effects on animals or on people who made sustained contact with it. Sit with that for a moment. The Greeks placed one of the most consequential rivers in their entire mythological system, the boundary of the underworld, the oath river of the gods, the source of Achilles' near immortality, at a location where the actual physical water was genuinely harmful to living things, where real animals refused to drink, where the real ground around it had a quality that real human beings found oppressive and strange. They did not invent the Styx from nothing, and then assign it a location. They found a place that already felt like the border of something, that already had properties which did not belong to the comfortable, sun-warmed world of the living, and they named it accordingly. This is how mythology actually works when you trace it back far enough. Not as fabrication, but as interpretation, as the human mind encountering something real and strange and beyond easy explanation, and reaching for the largest available framework to contain it. The Mavroneri was real. Its properties were real. The dread it inspired was real. And from that real foundation, a river wound 9 times around the underworld, and gods swore their most sacred oaths, and heroes submerged their children hoping to purchase permanence. But the archaeological and historical dimension of the Styx extends further still than a single Arcadian waterfall, because the ancient Greeks took the water seriously in ways that went beyond myth-making and into active, practical use. The most extraordinary claim in this regard and it is one that a growing number of historians and classical scholars have taken with increasing seriousness. Concerns Alexander the Great. Alexander, who by the time of his death in 323 BCE had conquered more of the known world than any military commander before or since, who had crossed deserts and mountains and rivers that his predecessors would have considered impassable, who had faced down armies that outnumbered his own by extraordinary margins and won. Alexander, in the prime of his life and at the height of his power, died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 32. The causes of his death have been debated by historians for more than 2,000 years. Fever is the conventional answer. Typhoid, perhaps, complicated by other infections. Excessive drinking. The accumulated toll of extraordinary physical exertion and multiple serious wounds. These are all reasonable candidates, and none of them is fully satisfying because none of them quite accounts for the specific pattern and progression of his symptoms as the ancient sources describe them. In 2010, a classical scholar named Adrian Mayer, working alongside other researchers, proposed a hypothesis that reframed the discussion entirely. The ancient sources noted that Alexander's body showed an extraordinary and deeply strange property in the days following his death. It did not decompose. For 6 days, 6 days in the heat of a Babylonian summer, the body of Alexander the Great showed no signs of putrefaction whatsoever. This so astonished his companions that some of them concluded he was not dead at all, that he was in some kind of suspended state, perhaps still hovering between worlds. The hypothesis Mayer advanced was this: Alexander had been poisoned with water from the Styx, from the Mavroneri, and the known toxic properties of that water, including, in certain concentrations, a capacity to dramatically slow or inhibit bacterial processes, might account for both the death and the extraordinary preservation. The water that killed him, in other words, also temporarily mummified him. It gave him, in the most grim and ironic possible way, a brief and terrible form of the immortality the river was mythologically famous for bestowing. This is not proven. It should be said plainly. This is a hypothesis, not a settled historical conclusion. The ancient sources are not reliable enough, the toxicological picture not clean enough for certainty. But it has been taken seriously by serious people, and it has the particular texture of things that might be true, the kind of uncomfortable fit between evidence and explanation that makes you return to it repeatedly, turning it over, unwilling to put it fully down. What it reveals, regardless of its ultimate truth or falsity, is the degree to which the Styx occupied real space in the ancient world. Not merely imaginative space, not merely theological space, real, practical, geopolitical space. People used its water. They stored it in special vessels. The ancient sources describe containers made of lead or of the hooves of horses, because these were the only materials said to withstand the water's corrosive properties without degrading. They transported it. They deployed it, whether as poison, the sacred substance, as the literal embodiment of mythological power applied to real-world problems. The water of the Styx was treated as a genuine material with genuine effects. The lead vessels are particularly striking, that the ancients understood, empirically if not chemically, that ordinary containers could not hold this water, that it required something specifically resistant to its properties, speaks to a tradition of observation and accumulated knowledge that had nothing to do with storytelling. Somebody tried a clay jar. It failed. Somebody tried bronze. It failed. Somebody discovered that lead held, and that knowledge was passed down, generation to generation, as part of the practical law surrounding the most sacred and dangerous water in the Greek world. The Mavroneri still flows today. The waterfall still descends from its high cliff in the Aronian Mountains. The water is still cold, still dark in certain lights, still possessed of a quality that visitors consistently describe as difficult to name precisely. a sense of something older than the landscape around it, something that does not quite belong to the ordinary world. You can go there. You can stand at its edge. You can listen to it fall. And if you are quiet enough and still enough and willing to let the distance between mythology and geography collapse entirely for a moment, you can almost feel what the ancient Greeks felt when they stood in that same place, in that same cold air, and decided that this was the edge of something, that just beyond this waterfall, just beneath this dark water, the ordinary world ended and something else entirely began. They were not wrong to feel that. Not wrong at all. The Styx earns its mythology. It earns every oath sworn in its name, every hero submerged in its current, every soul ferried across its surface in the dark. Because even when you find it on a map, even when you stand beside it in the real world and feel the cold spray of it on your face, it still feels like a border. And borders, even physical ones, always ask the same question of those who stand before them. How far are you willing to go? Every great myth survives for a reason, not by accident, and not merely by the momentum of tradition, not simply because one generation passed it to the next out of habit or obligation. The myths that endure across millennia, that cross the boundaries of language and culture and century without losing their essential power, survive because they are doing something that nothing else can do quite as well. They are carrying something true, not literally true perhaps, in the way that a tax record or a surveyor's measurement is true, but true in the deeper, more stubborn sense, true the way music is true, true in the way that a particular slant of afternoon light in autumn is true, not provable, not quantifiable, but undeniable to anyone paying attention. The Styx is one of those myths, and it has been flowing without interruption for approximately 3,000 years of recorded human thought. Longer, almost certainly, if we account for the oral traditions that preceded the written ones. The stories told around fires, in the dark, long before anyone thought to press them into clay or ink. 3,000 years is not a number to move past quickly. It deserves a moment of genuine consideration. Every civilization that has risen and fallen in that span, and there have been many, extraordinary ones, civilizations of extraordinary sophistication and ambition, has either been shaped by the Styx directly, or has shaped something that was shaped by it. The Romans inherited it and made it their own, Latinizing its contours without diluting its power. Virgil, in the Aeneid, sent his hero Aeneas down to the underworld with a golden bow as his passage, and described the Styx and its ferryman with a specificity and a gravity that made clear he understood exactly what he was working with. This was not decoration for Virgil. This was cosmology. Dante, writing in the early 14th century in a Florence that had been Christian for 1,000 years, reached back past Christianity entirely and found the Styx waiting for him. In the Inferno, it appears as the fifth circle of hell, a swamp in Dante's rendering, filled with the wrathful and the sullen, those whose anger had consumed them in life, now submerged in the dark water of their own fury. Charon is there, Cerberus is there, the geography of the ancient Greek underworld is restructured, renamed, reframed within a Christian moral architecture, but the bones beneath it are unmistakably Greek. Dante understood that you do not discard a map simply because you have changed your theology, especially when the map still works. Milton drew from it. Shakespeare circled it. The Romantics, 2 centuries after Shakespeare, returned to it with the particular intensity of people who had spent considerable time trying to convince themselves they did not believe in it and had not entirely succeeded. And then modernity arrived, with its electric lights and its rational frameworks and its determination to explain everything in terms of cause and mechanism and measurable effect. And the Styx, which had survived the fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity and the Renaissance and the Reformation, survived modernity too. It surfaced in literature, in art, in music, in film. It appeared in the names of rivers in fantasy novels, in the titles of albums, in the visual language of countless artists reaching for an image that communicated boundary and darkness, and the particular solemn weight of a crossing from which there is no return. It is in our idioms. When we say that something is our Achilles heel, we are invoking, whether we know it or not, the River Styx. When we speak of crossing a threshold, of a point of no return, of the ferryman being paid, we are speaking the Styx's language, translated into the vernacular of daily life. The river has dissolved into the way we think, the way we speak, the metaphors we reach for instinctively when we need to describe the irreversible. This is not coincidence. This is the proof of a myth that has earned its permanence. But why this myth, specifically? Why the Styx, above so many others? The Greeks gave us extraordinary material. The labors of Heracles, the Trojan War, the wanderings of Odysseus, the tragedy of Oedipus, all of it magnificent, all of it enduring in its own right. What does the Styx have that places it in a category of its own, that makes it not merely a famous myth, but something closer to a permanent fixture of the human imagination? The answer, considered carefully, has several layers. The first is universality. Every human culture in the history of the world has had to reckon with death, not as an abstraction, but as the central, unavoidable organizing fact of mortal existence. Every tradition has needed a way to speak about it, to frame it, to give it shape and meaning and navigable structure. The Styx offers one of the most complete and satisfying solutions to that need ever devised. A river, because rivers are already liminal things by nature, already thresholds between one place and another, already possessing the quality of movement and direction and irreversibility that death requires as a metaphor. A river you cross, because crossing implies commitment in a way that other kinds of transit do not. A river with a ferryman, because the presence of a guide, however silent, however impassive, is more bearable than the alternative, which is crossing alone. The Greeks gave death a geography, and in doing so they gave it a logic, and in doing so they made it, if not less frightening, then at least more comprehensible. The Styx says, there is a route, there are rules, the crossing is managed. Whatever is on the other side, the passage itself is not chaos. It is a river, and rivers have banks, and you can stand on one bank and look across to the other, and understand that the distance, while significant, is not infinite. This is what mythology does at its most functional. It converts the unmanageable into the navigable. It turns the absolute into the procedural. And the Styx does it with extraordinary elegance. The second layer is the oath. The Styx is the guarantor of promises, as the place where even the most powerful beings in the cosmos came to make their words binding, speaks to something that every human society has struggled with in every era: the problem of trust. The problem of how you make a promise means something when power and convenience conspire to make breaking it attractive. The Styx answers this, not with law, not with social pressure, not with the threat of human punishment, but with something older and more fundamental: the invocation of a force that predates the current arrangement of things and will outlast it. To swear by the Styx was to appeal to something beyond the jurisdiction of any individual's power or self-interest. It was to say, I place this promise somewhere that I cannot reach to retrieve it. We still need this. We need it perhaps more acutely now than the Greeks did. We have contracts and courts and elaborate legal infrastructure, and all of it is useful, and none of it fully solves the problem the Styx was addressing. Because the problem the Styx was addressing was not legal. It was spiritual. It was the question of whether a promise, at its deepest level, can ever be truly binding. And the Styx answered yes. And the answer required a river older than the gods to make it stick. The third layer is the most personal, and perhaps the most important. The Styx endures because it tells the truth about vulnerability. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, had one small place where the water did not reach. One heel, one coordinate of mortality preserved within a body that was otherwise inviolable. And that is not a flaw in the myth. That is the myth's central, most honest, most quietly devastating insight. That invulnerability and vulnerability are not opposites, that they coexist, always, in every being that has ever drawn breath, that the closer you come to imperviousness, the more significant the gap that remains, because the gap is not incidental, it is definitional. It is what makes you what you are, rather than something else entirely. We are all Achilles in this regard. Every strength we possess creates, somewhere in its shadow, a corresponding exposure. Every armor has a seam. Every protection requires a grip. And wherever the grip is, the water does not reach. The Styx shows us this not as tragedy but as truth. And truths, even uncomfortable ones, have a way of lasting. The river flows still, not only in the Aronian mountains, though it flows there too, the Mavranari still descending from its cliff in the cold Arcadian air, still carrying its mineral darkness to the stream below. It flows in every story we tell about the irreversible, in every threshold we stand before with our hearts doing what hearts do when they understand that the step ahead cannot be untaken, in every promise we make to someone we love, pressing our sincerity into the words the way a coin was once pressed into the palm of the dead, hoping the weight of it is enough, hoping it carries. Charon is still at the bank. He always is, patient as water, patient as dark. The fee is still the same. It always has been, not the coin. The coin is a detail, a particular. The real fee is simpler and more demanding than any currency. The real fee is willingness, the willingness to cross, to commit to the far bank before you can see it clearly, to release, finally and completely, whatever it is you have been holding that belongs to the shore you are leaving. The Styx takes what you give it, it holds what it takes, and it flows on, 9 times around everything, as it always has, as it always will. Dark, deliberate, and absolutely, enduringly, magnificently eternal.